In addition to that, we engaged him to survey 30 other buildings that would become public fallout shelters. And we did this to augment the numbers of shelters that we have and find more buildings with more and better protection than we already had. And we were successful on both accounts. In our 5 MMS facilities, we did find fallout protection. 2 of the buildings would be able to use their ERs. In one building, which has their ERs in a single-story area of the building, it does not offer protection from radiation. Therefore, they know that they will have to move emergency department operations out of that area into other parts of the hospital. But knowing the threat, they can do that. They can shift their operations. Otherwise, their medical staff as well as their patient then become casualties. The other 2 hospitals, their ERs are well protected, as are most of their wards. Naturally, in all 3 buildings, there are areas that do not offer adequate protection, and those areas would have to be abandoned. The people evacuated, but we're not talking about hours or days to evacuate. We're talking about minutes, because it's a short distance. They don't have to leave the building. They just go to other parts of the building. In our public shelters, as I mentioned, we're aiming for somewhere around 150 buildings. These buildings would be open to the public, and these buildings, a large portion of them are publicly owned, schools primarily, but also university buildings. A large portion of them are also privately owned, and these include churches, shopping malls, banks, industrial and businesses. And this is all done on a voluntary basis, where they have agreed to allow their building to be, some of them, the newer ones, to be surveyed as a fallout shelter. Others had been surveyed decades in the past, but they've agreed to the use of the building as fallout shelters. They allowed the staff to volunteer to be trained as fallout shelter managers, and we were able to train 78 earlier this year as fallout manager staffs. And in the event, if there's time, to stock it. I don't really anticipate being able to stock shelters. If we had time, we'd make the attempt, but I don't believe we'll have that. The public is instructed, or would be instructed, to bring in water, food, bedding, and other personal items that they'll need. The agreement also allows us to mark the buildings with the fallout shelter signs, which we have not yet done, but that's something we're going to look at and address in the future.
You mentioned the fallout shelter signs. There's a museum in California that has those. Do you think those signs will be unsettling or reassuring?
It's also a well-recognized site, and when they see that, they know what it means. Now, there are also a large number of buildings where the signs that still are in place from the 60s and 70s. So people identify with that. These signs they're freshly painted, they're bright, and show the same yellow background and black symbols. So it should be a reassurance to them that there is protection there. Because we have not posted them, but once they're posted, and these would be posted near entrances, they could identify that building as a public fallout shelter, because the people who agreed for the use of the buildings did allow the names of their building to be posted in public places. And again, if there ever is a nuclear crisis, public information is going to be a key component. The public in general is very ignorant of this subject. There's not been much published. It is available online, but not many people go and avail themselves of the resources, so that they just simply don't know. And in the event of a crisis, one of our first things we're going to do is to educate the public. And some of the key things that we're going to do is tell them where the shelters are. We'll have graphics for television, the print media as well, instructions on what to bring and under what circumstances they'll go. We would not actually, we can activate shelters at one point if there is sufficient warning, and put the shelter staff, the shelter managers that we've trained, and the owners on notice that we need to activate shelters. And under those conditions, the managers would have the authority to go in, activate the shelter, but not open it to the public. because this would disrupt a lot of the operations of the buildings. Public would only be allowed to come into the shelters upon an actual event or a strategic warning issued by the federal government.
When we were kids, we thought an all-out attack from the Soviet Union was hopeless to prepare for. What about today's situation?
I grew up in your generation as well. In fact, my father was in the Air Force in the Strategic Air Command. We moved from base to base. But I never saw or never had any, this applies to both military-run schools as well as civilian-run public schools. I never had any instruction on what to do. So I'll plead ignorance as to what people were taught because I simply never had that experience. My background here is all that I've gained from my experience later in the Air Force as a disaster preparedness officer and in my job here in emergency management. I looked at the situation, that there is a threat, and I think it's a very credible threat that at some point someone is going to use, whether it's a nation like Iran, Iraq, North Korea, or a group like Al-Qaeda, Hamas, or Hezbollah will use a nuclear weapon. And if it happens here in the United States, the threat posed by a fallout away from the blast area, if people are outside of the blast area, there is no reason they cannot survive even very high levels of radiation if they're in a fallout shelter.